The winter of 1940 settled heavily over the American Midwest, and in cities like Detroit the cold seemed to sharpen every sound of industry that echoed through the night. Assembly lines still produced sedans and trucks meant for civilian roads, but beneath the routine hum lay a growing sense that the nation's factories were out of step with a world racing toward catastrophe. Across the Atlantic, cities burned, armies clashed, and entire economies bent themselves toward total war. In the United States, the distance offered safety but also denial, and the automobile plants stood as monuments to peacetime abundance in a world rapidly running out of peace. American automakers were unmatched in their mastery of mass production, yet in 1940 that strength had little military purpose. Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler measured success in annual sales, styling changes, and consumer choice, not in armored plating or aircraft tolerances. Their factories were optimized for speed and volume, not for the extreme precision demanded by weapons of war. But the very techniques that made them powerful, standardized parts, moving assembly lines, disciplined labor, were quietly becoming the most valuable industrial assets on Earth. Events abroad began to expose the limits of America's neutrality. Britain, battered by air raids and submarine attacks, could not manufacture enough weapons to survive alone. France fell with shocking speed, its industrial heartland lost almost overnight. Reports filtering back to Washington revealed a brutal truth. Modern war was no longer decided solely by generals and soldiers, but by factories, supply chains, and the capacity to replace losses faster than the enemy could destroy them. The United States possessed that capacity, even if it had not yet accepted what it meant. Franklin Roosevelt understood this before most. He spoke not of armies, but of production, framing the coming struggle as a test of industrial will. His call for America to become the arsenal of democracy was not rhetoric. It was a warning that time itself had become the most dangerous enemy. Each month of hesitation allowed Axis factories to refine weapons, stockpile munitions, and prepare for a conflict that would eventually demand American involvement whether the public wished it or not. Inside the auto plants, reactions were mixed. Executives feared government interference, unions worried about layoffs and wage controls, and workers sensed uncertainty without yet seeing opportunity. The Great Depression still haunted factory floors, and no one wanted to gamble stability on a distant war. Yet contracts began to appear, first modest, then ambitious, asking automakers to produce engines, trucks, and artillery parts alongside civilian vehicles. These early requests were awkward, inefficient, and often resisted, but they marked the beginning of an irreversible transformation. The challenge was not simply what to build, but how fast it needed to happen. European factories had been preparing for years, adapting machine tools, and training workers long before the first bombs fell. American automakers were being asked to compress that process into months. Entire production philosophies had to change, from tolerances measured in fractions of an inch to ones measured in thousandths, from chrome finishes to hardened steel, from marketing departments to military inspectors who rejected anything less than perfection. Even before Pearl Harbor, the auto industry began to feel the weight of war pressing inward. Engineers studied blueprints for aircraft engines they had never seen assembled. Toolmakers reconfigured presses designed for fenders into machines capable of shaping armor plate. The learning curve was steep and unforgiving, but failure was no longer theoretical. Each mistake meant delays that could translate into lost ships, lost planes, and lost lives thousands of miles away. By the end of 1940, something subtle but profound had shifted. The automobile was no longer the unquestioned symbol of American industrial identity. In its place emerged a broader, more dangerous role, one that demanded sacrifice, discipline, and speed on a scale the industry had never attempted. The factories still stood, the assembly lines still moved, but their future was no longer measured in model years. It was measured in whether democracy itself could be manufactured quickly enough to survive. As 1941 unfolded, the gap between America's industrial potential and its military readiness became impossible to ignore. The Army Air Corps projected a need for tens of thousands of aircraft, while the Navy demanded ships, engines, and vehicles at a scale that dwarfed existing contracts. Traditional arms manufacturers simply could not meet those demands alone. The uncomfortable conclusion formed inside Washington was that only the automobile industry, vast, disciplined, and geographically concentrated, had the capacity to close the gap in time. What had once been a consumer-driven economy was now being quietly drafted into war. The transition required a new kind of partnership, one that blurred the line between private enterprise and federal authority. Government agencies began embedding inspectors, engineers, and planners directly into corporate headquarters. Production targets were no longer suggestions, but imperatives backed by national survival. Automakers accustomed to autonomy now found themselves negotiating specifications with military officers who spoke the language of combat rather than commerce. The friction was constant, but it forced both sides to confront a shared reality. Efficiency alone was not enough without coordination. Detroit became the nerve center of this industrial awakening. Office buildings filled with maps of supply routes, raw material allocations, and production forecasts stretching years into the future. Steel, aluminum, rubber, and copper were suddenly strategic resources, rationed and prioritized with mathematical precision. Automakers learned that a single shortage, ball bearings, machine tools, even skilled welders, could ripple outward, stalling entire production lines. The war was teaching them that modern conflict was as much about logistics as firepower. The learning process was brutal. Early military contracts exposed weaknesses that peacetime competition had hidden. Engines failed stress tests, armor plates cracked under impact, and aircraft components arrived out of tolerance. Each failure demanded redesigns, retraining, and retooling, often under intense political pressure. Yet these setbacks forced innovation at unprecedented speed. Engineers who once refined body styles now solved problems of heat dissipation, vibration, and metallurgical fatigue, issues where failure meant death, not dissatisfied customers. Labor, too, was being transformed. Skilled workers were scarce, and training programs expanded almost overnight. Men who had spent decades installing dashboards learned to assemble gun mounts and engine blocks. Women, long excluded from heavy industrial work, entered the factories in growing numbers, reshaping both the workforce and the culture of production. The rhythm of the assembly line remained, but its purpose had changed, infusing daily labor with a sense of urgency that transcended wages or brand loyalty. Behind the scenes, executives wrestled with the implications of this shift. Profit margins shrank under fixed-price contracts, and mistakes could lead to penalties or canceled orders. Yet refusing the work was no longer an option. Public opinion was turning, and companies that resisted war production risked being labeled unpatriotic or worse, irrelevant. Cooperation became not just a civic duty, but a strategic necessity for corporate survival in a wartime economy. As military orders multiplied, civilian automobile production began to feel increasingly anachronistic. New car models seemed trivial against headlines of bombed cities and sinking ships. Sales declined, not only because of material shortages, but because the national mood was changing. Americans sensed that the age of abundance was ending, at least temporarily, and that their factories were needed elsewhere. The automobile industry was being stripped of its peacetime identity piece by piece. By late 1941, the transformation was still incomplete, but momentum had taken hold. The automakers had crossed a psychological threshold, accepting that they were no longer preparing for a possibility, but responding to an inevitability. The question was no longer whether America's factories would be turned into instruments of war, but whether they could do so fast enough. Time was narrowing, and the world beyond America's shores was already on fire. The attack on Pearl Harbor shattered any remaining illusions that time could be managed or delayed. Overnight, war production ceased to be a strategic option and became an absolute command. Within days, federal directives froze civilian automobile manufacturing entirely, ending an era that had defined American life for decades. Showrooms emptied, model lines vanished, and the tools of consumer desire were abruptly repurposed for survival. The silence left behind by halted car production was filled immediately by the roar of retooling, as factories prepared for tasks far more unforgiving than market competition. The scale of the shift was staggering. Assembly lines designed for chrome trim and upholstery were torn apart and rebuilt to handle armor plating, aircraft frames, and engine blocks weighing tons. Entire plants shut down for weeks not because work had stopped, but because transformation had begun. Machine tools were relocated, floors reinforced, ceilings raised, and power systems upgraded to support heavier loads. This was not gradual adaptation. It was industrial surgery performed at full speed, with no margin for hesitation. Automakers were now producing weapons systems whose complexity rivaled anything they had previously attempted. Tanks demanded tolerances that could withstand recoil and cross-country punishment. Aircraft engines required precision that allowed them to function at high altitude under extreme thermal stress. A single flaw could doom an entire crew. The factories responded by reinventing quality control, embedding inspection at every stage of production rather than relying on inline checks. Precision became a moral obligation, not just a technical standard. The War Production Board imposed order on the chaos, dictating what could be built, where resources would flow, and which factories would receive priority. Executives accustomed to competition now found themselves coordinating output with rivals, sharing tooling designs and manufacturing techniques once guarded as trade secrets. The logic was ruthless but effective. Duplication was waste, and waste was now an enemy. Cooperation replaced rivalry, creating an industrial ecosystem unified by necessity rather than profit. One of the most striking changes occurred in the role of engineering. Automobile designers who once focused on aesthetics were thrust into the realm of applied physics and battlefield realities. They studied combat reports, consulted with military technicians, and modified designs based on frontline feedback. When a tank transmission failed in North Africa, the fix might be engineered in Detroit within weeks, then implemented across thousands of units. The distance between factory and battlefield collapsed, linking production decisions directly to survival in combat. The human cost of the transition was immense. Workers labored long shifts under relentless schedules, knowing delays could mean defeat somewhere far beyond their view. Accidents increased as new machinery pushed physical limits, and fatigue became a constant companion. Yet absenteeism dropped, and productivity soared. The factories became places of shared purpose, where individual exhaustion was absorbed into a collective determination to meet impossible quotas. Communities around these plants transformed just as rapidly. Housing shortages emerged as workers flooded into industrial centers, and local infrastructure strained under the pressure. Schools adjusted schedules to accommodate working parents, and small businesses reshaped themselves around shift changes. War production was no longer confined within factory walls. It reorganized daily life, bending entire cities toward a single objective that demanded total participation. By early 1942, America's automakers were no longer pretending to be something they were not. They had become military manufacturers in both function and mindset, operating under the relentless logic of wartime necessity. The question was no longer whether they could build weapons, but whether they could outproduce enemies who had spent years preparing for exactly this moment. The answer would emerge not in speeches or promises, but in steel, engines, and the relentless motion of assembly lines that no longer slept. The demands placed on America's automakers soon moved beyond quantity and into the realm of sheer variety. War did not require a single product, but an entire universe of machines, each designed for a specific environment and tactical role. Factories that once produced a narrow range of vehicles were now expected to manufacture tanks, trucks, aircraft engines, artillery components, and specialized tools simultaneously. This diversity challenged the very logic of mass production, forcing companies to innovate not just in scale, but in flexibility. Nowhere was this more evident than in the production of military vehicles. The Army required everything from nimble reconnaissance cars to heavy transport trucks capable of hauling supplies across deserts, jungles, and frozen terrain. Automakers had to design vehicles that could be repaired in the field with limited tools, using parts that were interchangeable across models. This requirement reshaped engineering philosophy, emphasizing durability and simplicity over elegance. The result was a generation of machines built to endure abuse rather than admiration. Aircraft manufacturing pushed the industry even further. Automakers with no prior experience in aviation were suddenly tasked with producing engines and airframes whose tolerances bordered on the microscopic. Aluminum replaced steel as the dominant material in many plants, demanding new skills, new welding techniques, and new safety protocols. Factories once defined by the smell of oil and rubber now rang with the sounds of riveting and precision machining. Each successful aircraft engine that left the line represented not just production capacity, but a triumph of rapid industrial learning. Standardization became the quiet hero of this transformation. Military planners insisted that parts produced in different factories across the country fit together perfectly. This demand required unprecedented coordination, with blueprints shared nationally and production methods aligned across corporate boundaries. A crankshaft produced in Michigan had to function seamlessly in an engine assembled in California. The achievement of this level of uniformity, under wartime pressure, redefined what mass production could accomplish. The logistical backbone supporting this effort grew just as complex. Raw materials flowed into factories from mines, refineries, and mills that operated on their own war footing. Transportation networks were reorganized to prioritize military cargo, and delays were treated as strategic failures. Automakers learned that their success depended not only on what happened inside their plants, but on a vast, interconnected system stretching across the continent. War production turned the entire nation into a single, extended factory floor. Training programs expanded to meet the technical demands of this new reality. Workers were taught advanced machining, blueprint reading, and quality inspection at a pace never before attempted. Veterans of the assembly line became instructors, passing hard-earned knowledge to recruits drawn from every corner of society. The workforce grew more skilled even as it grew larger, creating a depth of industrial expertise that would have been unimaginable only a few years earlier. Yet mistakes remained inevitable. Early production runs sometimes failed under combat conditions, revealing weaknesses that could not be detected in testing alone. Instead of denial, the response was iteration. Design flaws were corrected, materials upgraded, and processes refined with ruthless efficiency. The feedback loop between battlefield and factory tightened further, ensuring that each lesson paid forward into improved equipment and increased survivability. By mid-1942, the American automobile industry had evolved into something fundamentally new. It was no longer defined by a single product or market, but by its ability to adapt, standardize, and deliver at scale under extreme pressure. This transformation did more than supply a military. It reshaped the very idea of industrial power. America was learning that victory in modern war would belong not to the nation with the largest army, but to the one whose factories could outthink, outbuild, and outlast every opponent. As production intensified, the automobile industry confronted an enemy that could not be defeated with machinery alone: time. Every month carried new demands from commanders overseas, and delays reverberated across entire theaters of war. Automakers were forced to compress development cycles that once took years into mere weeks. Prototypes were rushed from drafting tables to factory floors, tested, modified, and pushed into mass production with unprecedented speed. The margin for error narrowed until it nearly vanished, transforming industrial decision-making into a high-stakes exercise in calculated risk. The pressure reshaped management itself. Traditional corporate hierarchies proved too slow for wartime realities, and authority shifted toward engineers and production specialists who could solve problems quickly. Decisions once debated through layers of bureaucracy were now made on factory floors, often in real time. This decentralization empowered innovation, allowing local managers to adapt processes without waiting for approval from distant offices. Speed became as valuable a resource as steel or labor. One of the most significant breakthroughs involved the integration of statistical quality control. Instead of inspecting finished products and rejecting failures, factories began monitoring production processes continuously to prevent defects from occurring at all. This approach reduced waste, improved reliability, and allowed automakers to meet military standards without crippling slowdowns. The war accelerated the adoption of these methods, embedding them into American manufacturing long after the conflict would end. Labor relations also entered a fragile but critical phase. Strikes, once common in the industry, were now framed as threats to national security. Unions and management negotiated under intense public scrutiny, balancing workers' rights against the demands of total war. Agreements limited work stoppages in exchange for job security and standardized wages, creating a tense but functional partnership. The factory floor became a place where economic conflict was temporarily subordinated to collective survival. The workforce itself grew more diverse than ever before. Women took on roles previously considered unsuitable for them, mastering heavy machinery and precision tasks with remarkable speed. African American workers migrated north in large numbers, seeking industrial jobs that promised both income and dignity, even as discrimination persisted. These changes did not erase inequality, but they cracked long-standing barriers, altering the social fabric of industrial America in ways that could not be undone. Fatigue and strain became constant companions. Shifts stretched longer, production quotas rose relentlessly, and accidents remained a grim reality. Yet absenteeism remained low, driven by a shared understanding that factory output was directly tied to the fate of soldiers overseas. War bond drives, honor boards, and public recognition programs reinforced this connection, turning production milestones into symbols of collective contribution. Behind every finished vehicle or engine lay a web of improvisation. Shortages forced engineers to substitute materials, redesign components, and find creative solutions to bottlenecks. Rubber scarcity led to synthetic alternatives, while aluminum shortages demanded careful allocation. Each adaptation carried risks, but standing still carried greater danger. The automakers learned to treat constraints not as obstacles, but as catalysts for innovation. By late 1942, the industry had reached a grim efficiency. Production numbers climbed even as resources tightened, proving that the system could absorb pressure without collapse. America's automakers were no longer reacting to war, they were driving its industrial tempo. The factories had become engines of momentum, pushing the conflict toward a scale where output itself began to shape strategy, forcing enemies to confront a reality they could not match, a nation that had learned how to turn speed into power. As 1943 began, the results of America's industrial transformation became visible far beyond factory walls. Allied commanders could now plan operations based not on scarcity, but on projected abundance. Automakers were delivering vehicles and components in numbers that reshaped strategic thinking, allowing armies to move faster, farther, and with greater confidence. The industrial tempo set in Detroit and other manufacturing hubs began to dictate the rhythm of the war itself, turning production schedules into instruments of strategy. The Jeep emerged as one of the clearest symbols of this shift. Designed for versatility and simplicity, it embodied the lessons automakers had learned under pressure. Its standardized parts, rugged construction, and ease of repair made it indispensable across every theater of war. Factories refined its production continuously, reducing assembly time while improving reliability. Each Jeep rolling off the line represented not just a vehicle, but a philosophy of design born from the marriage of industrial efficiency and battlefield necessity. Heavy trucks told a similar story on an even larger scale. Supply lines stretched across continents, and the success of Allied campaigns depended on the steady flow of fuel, ammunition, and food. Automakers produced fleets of transport vehicles capable of operating in extreme conditions, from desert heat to Arctic cold. These machines were not glamorous, but they were decisive. Without them, no offensive could be sustained, and no victory could be consolidated. Aircraft engines built by former automakers reached the skies in staggering numbers. Plants that had once produced thousands of car engines per day now applied the same discipline to aviation power plants, achieving output levels previously thought impossible. Quality improved alongside quantity, as refinements driven by combat feedback reduced failure rates. Pilots trusted these engines with their lives, a testament to how thoroughly the industry had mastered an unfamiliar and unforgiving craft. The ripple effects of this production extended to shipbuilding and ordnance as well. Automotive firms manufactured gun mounts, fire control systems, and precision components that fed into larger weapons platforms. Their expertise in modular assembly allowed complex systems to be broken down into manageable units, accelerating overall output. The war machine became a mosaic of interconnected parts, each shaped by the logic of mass production. At the human level, the factories developed their own culture of endurance. Workers tracked production milestones with the same intensity soldiers tracked advances on maps. Each completed quota became a small victory, reinforcing morale during grueling schedules. The sense of shared mission blurred the line between civilian and combatant, binding factory labor to frontline outcomes in a tangible, emotional way. Innovation continued even amid success. Engineers sought incremental improvements that multiplied across thousands of units, saving fuel, extending service life, or simplifying maintenance. These changes rarely made headlines, but their cumulative effect was profound. The war rewarded not dramatic breakthroughs alone, but the relentless refinement that only disciplined industrial systems could sustain. By mid-1943, America's automakers had helped shift the balance of the conflict. The Allies now possessed not just the will to fight, but the means to outlast and overwhelm. Production figures became strategic weapons, shaping campaigns and forcing enemy planners into defensive calculations. The factories had become silent partners in every advance, their output flowing invisibly into victories measured not in units produced, but in ground gained and lives saved. By the summer of 1943, the transformation of America's auto industry had become nothing short of revolutionary. What had begun as an uneasy alignment between government and business had matured into a fully integrated war production machine. Detroit's skyline, once defined by smokestacks releasing the rhythm of consumer prosperity, now pulsed with a relentless energy tied directly to national survival. Every plant, every assembly line, and every worker had become a node in a system designed to outpace and outproduce the Axis powers. The integration of new technologies accelerated this process. Automated machinery, once a luxury, became a necessity, and innovations in welding, stamping, and casting allowed factories to produce components faster and with greater precision. Engineers adapted automotive presses to shape armored hulls, and entire production methods were redesigned to accommodate unprecedented volume. These technological leaps were not incremental. They were leaps born of urgency, combining creativity with necessity on a scale never before witnessed in industrial history. The human element remained critical. Workers, many of whom had been unskilled or semi-skilled, were now operating highly specialized equipment under immense pressure. Training programs expanded exponentially, often running around the clock. Experienced machinists, engineers, and supervisors became mentors, transmitting knowledge that had previously taken years to acquire in mere weeks. The pace of learning rivaled the pace of production, creating a workforce that was both highly skilled and battle-ready in its own right. Cooperation between companies also reached unprecedented levels. Rival firms, once guarded over patents and market share, now shared designs, tooling methods, and best practices under government supervision. Standardization became the law of survival. A tank transmission from one plant had to fit seamlessly with a hull from another, a practice that required meticulous coordination. Competition gave way to collaboration, forging a network of industrial unity that rivaled the organizational sophistication of any army. The war also reshaped the relationship between labor and management. Strikes were minimized through wage standardization, bonus systems, and patriotic appeals, while unions gained influence in negotiating working conditions and hours. Women, who had entered the workforce in massive numbers, now held positions previously closed to them, operating machinery, managing inventory, and supervising lines. This period marked a profound social shift, one in which the production of war became intertwined with the expansion of opportunity, even amid pervasive inequalities. Innovation was not confined to large-scale manufacturing. Engineers continuously experimented with materials and techniques to overcome shortages. Aluminum, rubber, and high-grade steel were rationed strategically, forcing creative substitutions. Prototypes were tested rigorously, failures analyzed swiftly, and improvements deployed immediately across multiple plants. This rapid iteration process mirrored the battlefield itself. Every lesson learned had immediate consequences for survival and effectiveness. The scale of production began to affect military strategy. Planners could count on a steady stream of trucks, tanks, and aircraft, allowing them to coordinate large-scale offensives that were previously impossible. Supply became a reliable weapon, enabling extended campaigns in North Africa, the Pacific Islands, and Europe. The speed and reliability of American manufacturing directly influenced operational planning, turning factories into strategic assets on a par with armies and navies. By late 1943, the American automobile industry had not only met the demands of war, it had reshaped the very notion of what industrial power could achieve. Factories no longer produced consumer goods. They produced the instruments of global conflict with precision, speed, and relentless efficiency. The transformation was complete. An industry built for peace had become the backbone of a worldwide military effort, proving that in modern war, production could determine the fate of nations as decisively as battles themselves. By early 1944, the fruits of America's industrial metamorphosis became undeniable on the global stage. Allied commanders now coordinated campaigns with the confidence that supply lines would not falter, vehicles would arrive where needed, and replacement parts would be available in the quantities required. The scale of output from auto factories allowed operations like the Normandy invasion to be planned with unprecedented precision, where logistics were no longer a limiting factor but a strategic advantage. The factories had become silent generals, directing the war from thousands of miles away through the steady flow of machines and material. Tanks exemplified this transformation. The once awkward partnership between automotive engineers and military designers now produced armored vehicles in record numbers, each refined for combat reliability. Lessons from the front lines were quickly relayed back to Detroit, prompting design adjustments that increased survivability and operational effectiveness. The cyclical feedback between battlefield experience and factory floor engineering became a cornerstone of American industrial strategy, ensuring that production directly reinforced combat readiness rather than simply supplying numbers. Aircraft production surged in parallel. Automakers adapted their mass production techniques to complex airplane engines, turning factories into aerial arsenals. Each engine represented a triumph of precision engineering under pressure, capable of powering bombers and fighters in the harshest conditions. The speed at which these plants could churn out reliable power plants astonished both allies and enemies, dramatically shifting the balance in air campaigns across Europe and the Pacific. The line between automotive ingenuity and military necessity had blurred entirely. Supply trucks, jeeps, and other ground vehicles became the lifeblood of Allied operations. Roads, beaches, and deserts were crossed with unprecedented efficiency, transforming strategy from static defense to dynamic mobility. Automakers had not only learned to build vehicles, but to anticipate the environments in which they would operate, engineering durability into every component. Each tire, axle, and chassis was a product of both experience and foresight, designed to function under extreme and unpredictable conditions, often where repair resources were scarce. The organizational lessons were equally profound. Coordinating the output of hundreds of plants required new forms of management, scheduling, and communication. Factories operated as nodes in a vast, interconnected network, with federal agencies acting as conductors orchestrating materials, labor, and machinery. The scale of this industrial choreography was unprecedented, demanding real-time problem-solving and near-perfect timing. In many ways, the war had turned the entire nation into a single, massive, coordinated factory. Women and minority workers continued to redefine industrial labor. Their contributions went far beyond filling temporary gaps. They became specialists, supervisors, and engineers in fields previously closed to them. The social shifts catalyzed by wartime necessity began to leave lasting marks, altering both workforce demographics and expectations. Factories became not just engines of production, but instruments of social change, where the demands of total war intersected with evolving concepts of equality and capability. The relentless pace exacted a human toll, yet morale remained high. Workers were acutely aware that each completed vehicle, engine, or gun mount had a direct impact on the lives of soldiers and sailors across the globe. Recognition programs, community support, and patriotic framing transformed exhaustion into motivation. In this way, the industrial home front became a theater of its own, where determination and discipline were measured in output and precision rather than bullets or strategy. By mid-1944, the American auto industry had become an unstoppable force, capable of producing not only the sheer quantity of war material, but the quality demanded by global combat. The collaboration of engineers, workers, executives, and government agencies had transformed peacetime production into a sophisticated instrument of victory. The factories were no longer neutral observers of history. They were active participants, shaping strategy, sustaining armies, and demonstrating that industrial power could, in itself, change the course of a world at war. By the autumn of 1944, the magnitude of America's industrial contribution to the war was impossible to ignore. Ships were supplied, planes were fueled, and armies were on the move, all sustained by the relentless output of factories originally designed to build consumer automobiles. Production numbers had reached staggering heights, with thousands of vehicles and engines leaving assembly lines weekly. The sheer scale of this industrial capacity had begun to shape not just tactics, but entire campaigns, giving the Allies a decisive edge over enemies who struggled to replace losses at the same speed. The lessons of standardization bore fruit in combat. Tanks, trucks, and jeeps could be repaired quickly in the field using interchangeable parts, reducing downtime and allowing sustained offensives. Supply chains no longer relied on improvisation. Maintenance and logistics became predictable, reliable systems. Soldiers could trust that their vehicles and equipment would function as intended, a confidence that translated into operational effectiveness and morale. The precision and foresight embedded in the factories now had tangible consequences on battlefields thousands of miles away. Aircraft production reached unprecedented complexity and efficiency. Former automakers had become adept at producing engines and airframes under exacting military standards. Heavy bombers, fighters, and transport planes rolled off the lines in numbers that allowed coordinated campaigns to dominate the skies. Combat experience informed continuous refinements, ensuring that design flaws were corrected almost in real time. This integration of industrial capability and tactical feedback became a defining feature of the Allied advantage, demonstrating that production itself could act as a force multiplier. The workforce, now seasoned by years of relentless schedules, had achieved extraordinary proficiency. New systems of training, mentorship, and cross-functional labor allowed factories to operate at peak efficiency, even as demand escalated further. Women and minority workers, who had become essential to the industrial machine, continued to excel in roles once denied to them, creating a workforce that was both highly skilled and uniquely adaptable. The social transformation accompanying this productivity reshaped American labor, leaving legacies far beyond the war itself. Innovation continued to accelerate under pressure. Engineers experimented with lightweight alloys, synthetic materials, and modular designs to optimize output. Each improvement was rapidly disseminated across plants, creating an environment where ideas traveled faster than production delays could accumulate. Even minor refinements, reducing engine weight, improving cooling systems, or standardizing bolt sizes, had enormous cumulative effects across thousands of vehicles, directly impacting operational success overseas. Coordination between government and industry became seamless. The War Production Board had matured into a sophisticated management apparatus, capable of allocating resources, resolving bottlenecks, and prioritizing orders with surgical precision. Communication lines stretched from Washington to Detroit, Chicago, and the West Coast, ensuring that supply met demand almost instantly. This orchestration allowed the United States to function as a single, unified industrial organism, focused entirely on sustaining the war effort. Despite these successes, the human cost remained immense. Long hours, repetitive labor, and high-stakes pressure took a toll on physical and mental health. Accidents were common, and fatigue became a constant adversary. Yet a shared sense of purpose, reinforced by patriotic duty and community support, maintained morale. The factory floors were imbued with urgency, but also with pride. The knowledge that every component produced was a contribution to victory and a life saved on distant battlefields. By late 1944, the United States' ability to produce war material at scale had become a strategic weapon in its own right. The transformation of the automobile industry was complete. Peacetime factories had become war machines, capable of shaping the conflict as much as generals or armies could. The rhythm of assembly lines dictated the tempo of campaigns, and the relentless motion of production became inseparable from the course of the war itself. Victory was no longer just fought on battlefields, it was built, riveted, and driven off assembly lines across the nation. By early 1945, the American war production machine had reached a level of efficiency and scale that was historically unprecedented. Factories that had once produced stylish sedans and family trucks were now churning out thousands of tanks, jeeps, aircraft engines, and artillery components every week. This industrial output had become a strategic instrument, one that directly influenced the planning and execution of military operations on multiple continents. The tempo of production dictated the pace of offensives, allowing Allied commanders to move from defensive operations to decisive, coordinated strikes. The transformation of the auto industry into a wartime powerhouse had also fostered innovations that would have been unimaginable under peacetime constraints. Engineers developed modular components, interchangeable parts, and standardized systems that allowed vehicles and machinery to be repaired rapidly in the field. Every production improvement was multiplied across thousands of units, ensuring that each tank, truck, and aircraft could be deployed effectively with minimal downtime. The war became not just a test of strategy, but of the ability to produce, adapt, and sustain complex machines at enormous scale. Workforces had become highly specialized yet extraordinarily adaptable. Men and women who had entered the factories with little training were now proficient in sophisticated machinery, precision welding, and engine assembly. Veterans of the production lines served as trainers and problem solvers, creating a culture of rapid knowledge transfer that kept operations moving at breakneck speed. The human element, honed through exhaustion and discipline, had become as vital to victory as steel or aluminum. The integration of civilian and military planning was now seamless. The War Production Board acted as the nerve center for coordination, directing raw materials, labor, and machinery with meticulous precision. Factories were organized into networks that maximized efficiency, minimized waste, and prioritized strategic needs. Competition between corporations was set aside in favor of collaboration, creating a unified industrial front capable of delivering the quantity and quality of material demanded by global warfare. The social impact of this transformation was profound. Women continued to operate machinery, manage logistics, and supervise production, challenging pre-existing gender norms. African American workers gained access to skilled labor positions previously denied to them, reshaping both workforce demographics and the expectations of industrial labor. The war effort had become a catalyst for social change, with the factory floors serving as a crucible in which both production and opportunity were forged under extreme pressure. Innovation extended to materials as well. Shortages of rubber, steel, and aluminum forced engineers to experiment with synthetic substitutes and alternative alloys. Every adaptation required rapid testing, immediate feedback, and swift implementation, creating a culture in which creativity and pragmatism coexisted. These technological advances not only improved wartime output, but would later lay the groundwork for post-war industrial growth and the evolution of American manufacturing. Logistics became a decisive factor in operational success. The ability to move vehicles, spare parts, and fuel efficiently allowed Allied forces to sustain long campaigns across multiple theaters. Automakers were not merely supplying machines. They were enabling strategy, dictating where and how forces could maneuver. The battlefield was no longer defined solely by geography and firepower. It was shaped as much by production schedules, transportation networks, and industrial reliability. By mid-1945, the transformation of America's auto industry stood as one of the most remarkable feats of modern history. From peacetime comfort to wartime necessity, these factories had evolved into precision engines of conflict, capable of producing, adapting, and sustaining machinery on a scale that no other nation could match. Their output had not only supported victory, but had redefined the very concept of industrial power, proving that in modern warfare, the line between the front and the factory had disappeared entirely. By the summer of 1945, the scope of America's industrial achievement was undeniable. Factories that had once been symbols of consumer aspiration had become the backbone of global military operations. Production lines rolled without pause, generating tanks, trucks, jeeps, and aircraft engines in numbers that staggered the imagination. The industrial rhythm of Detroit, Flint, and Cleveland had become inseparable from the war effort. Victories overseas were as much the result of human skill on assembly lines as they were of tactics on the battlefield. The integration of engineering, production, and military feedback had reached its apex. Modifications based on frontline reports were incorporated into designs almost immediately, creating a feedback loop that ensured equipment evolved as rapidly as battle conditions demanded. Engines were refined to operate under extreme climates, vehicles reinforced to withstand terrain punishment, and armor adjusted to counter new threats. The automakers had become agile problem solvers on a scale comparable to entire military staffs, responding in real time to the needs of distant campaigns. Quality control had matured into a science of its own. Factories employed rigorous testing at every stage, ensuring that each component met exacting standards before it left the plant. Failures were minimized, and equipment reliability improved dramatically, instilling confidence among soldiers and commanders alike. The lessons learned from mass-producing civilian vehicles had been elevated to a level where even the smallest detail, bolt torque, weld strength, engine calibration, could mean the difference between operational success and failure. The workforce, now highly trained and experienced, operated with remarkable efficiency. Men, women, and minority laborers had become indispensable to the war effort, mastering roles that demanded precision, endurance, and adaptability. Shift patterns were optimized, training programs expanded, and morale sustained through recognition programs and patriotic appeals. The industrial home front became a theater of continuous action, with the rhythm of work mirroring the urgency of the battles being fought overseas. Innovation continued to drive progress. Engineers found ways to stretch scarce materials, streamline assembly processes, and improve machine durability. Aluminum shortages led to lightweight design alternatives, rubber rationing spurred synthetic solutions, and modular design approaches allowed components to be produced across multiple factories without compatibility issues. These improvements were implemented in real time, turning factories into agile problem-solving networks rather than static production sites. The cooperation between government and private industry had become seamless. The War Production Board orchestrated the flow of materials, labor, and finished products, ensuring that strategic priorities were met with minimal delay. Automakers coordinated with one another, sharing techniques, blueprints, and innovations that accelerated output. Rivalries were suspended in service of a higher goal, ensuring that Allied forces had the equipment necessary to sustain victory across multiple theaters of war. Logistics and supply chains were now as precise as any military maneuver. Vehicles, spare parts, and engines were distributed with exacting coordination, ensuring that campaigns could advance without the delays that plagued previous wars. The industrial output of Detroit and other centers was directly linked to strategic success, proving that factories could influence the course of global conflict just as decisively as armies or navies. By late 1945, the full impact of America's automotive transformation was evident. Peacetime industries had become wartime powerhouses, producing quantities and qualities of material that no other nation could match. The factories had not only supplied victory, but had fundamentally altered the concept of industrial capacity in modern warfare. In the process, they demonstrated that American ingenuity, discipline, and scale could be mobilized overnight to meet challenges that once seemed impossible, reshaping both the nation and the war it had fought to win. By the end of 1945, the legacy of America's industrial mobilization was clear. The automobile industry had become the engine that powered victory. What had started as an uneasy collaboration between government and private enterprise had matured into a model of efficiency, innovation, and national purpose. The factories that once symbolized consumer choice now represented the nation's ability to adapt, endure, and dominate on a global scale. The sheer speed with which these plants had shifted from peacetime production to wartime necessity remained unparalleled in human history. The lessons learned were as much organizational as technical. Production planning, materials allocation, and labor management had evolved into a system capable of coordinating hundreds of factories across the continent. Standardization, modular design, and real-time problem-solving became hallmarks of industrial strategy. By integrating engineering, management, and frontline feedback, the automakers had created a production network that was flexible, resilient, and extraordinarily precise, a network that could be recalibrated as battlefield conditions changed. The human dimension remained critical. Workers had become highly skilled, adaptable, and disciplined, mastering new techniques under relentless pressure. Women and minority laborers had permanently altered the workforce, demonstrating capabilities that challenged pre-war assumptions. Factories became microcosms of society in transition, where the urgency of national survival accelerated social change alongside production. Patriotism, pride, and collective purpose became as essential as the machines themselves. Innovation continued to define the pace and scope of production. Engineers devised ways to conserve scarce resources while maintaining quality, experimented with synthetic materials, and continuously refined vehicle and engine designs. Every small improvement, replicated across thousands of units, magnified its effect on the battlefield. The wartime culture of continuous adaptation embedded in the factories created a feedback loop that pushed both production and innovation forward at an unprecedented pace. The coordination between industry and the military had become almost symbiotic. The War Production Board directed materials and prioritized tasks, while automakers supplied the expertise, manpower, and creativity necessary to meet impossible demands. This collaboration extended beyond individual companies, fostering an unprecedented level of information sharing and resource allocation. Competition was replaced by a unified industrial front, capable of sustaining global operations with remarkable efficiency. The ripple effects reached far beyond the factory floor. Reliable supply chains, standardized parts, and robust vehicles enabled the Allied forces to undertake complex campaigns that would have been impossible under previous logistical constraints. Operations in Europe and the Pacific were no longer limited by material shortages. Instead, production capacity allowed for flexibility, rapid deployment, and sustained offensives. American factories had become strategic assets, shaping military campaigns long before the first soldier set foot on the battlefield. Even in the face of exhaustion and risk, morale remained high. Workers understood that their labor had immediate consequences for the lives of soldiers and sailors abroad. Recognition programs, community support, and patriotic framing reinforced the connection between industrial output and national survival. Factories became more than production sites. They were centers of shared purpose, where effort, endurance, and ingenuity directly contributed to victory. By 1945, the transformation of the American automobile industry stood as a testament to human ingenuity, industrial power, and collective determination. Peacetime factories had become instruments of war, capable of producing the quantity, quality, and diversity of material necessary to sustain global conflict. The story of this transformation illustrated that victory in modern warfare depended as much on production, organization, and innovation as on strategy or courage, a lesson that would shape the future of American industry for decades to come. By the spring of 1945, the full magnitude of America's industrial effort had begun to resonate across the globe. The once clear distinction between civilian and military production had vanished entirely. Automakers, now fully transformed, were churning out vehicles, engines, and equipment at a pace and scale that no other nation could match. The rhythm of the assembly line had become the pulse of the war itself, driving campaigns, sustaining armies, and reshaping strategic possibilities in ways that few could have predicted only 5 years earlier. The Jeep and other light vehicles had become indispensable symbols of this industrial success. Small, durable, and versatile, they moved troops, supplies, and reconnaissance teams across terrains that had previously slowed even the most seasoned armies. The vehicles embodied the lessons learned by engineers under pressure: simplicity, standardization, and adaptability. Every Jeep rolling off the line represented not only innovation but the practical triumph of industrial strategy applied under extreme wartime constraints. Heavy trucks, meanwhile, formed the backbone of Allied logistics. They moved fuel, food, ammunition, and personnel across deserts, mountains, and frozen landscapes, sustaining offensives that would have been impossible without such reliable transportation. Engineers had learned to anticipate battlefield conditions, designing vehicles capable of operating under extreme temperatures, rough terrain, and limited maintenance resources. The reliability of these vehicles became a force multiplier, enabling the rapid mobility and supply efficiency that shaped entire campaigns. Aircraft engines manufactured by former automakers reached levels of precision and reliability previously unimaginable. Factories adapted mass production techniques to complex aviation needs, producing power plants that pilots could trust in combat situations where failure meant death. This marriage of automotive expertise and military technology allowed the United States to dominate the skies with unprecedented consistency, giving Allied forces a decisive advantage over enemy air operations. The workforce continued to define the war effort as much as machinery. Skilled and semi-skilled laborers, women, and minority workers had mastered complex processes, demonstrating adaptability and endurance under relentless schedules. Training programs and on-the-job mentorship transformed novices into specialists capable of maintaining the pace of production. Factories became arenas where human skill and industrial efficiency merged, producing both machines and morale simultaneously. Material shortages challenged engineers to innovate further. Steel, aluminum, and rubber were rationed strategically, prompting the development of synthetic substitutes, alternative alloys, and modular design practices. These adaptations were implemented rapidly, demonstrating a capacity for problem-solving that mirrored military agility. Every successful modification directly influenced the speed and effectiveness of Allied operations, highlighting the interdependence of industry and warfare. Coordination between government agencies and private companies reached new heights. The War Production Board orchestrated priorities, logistics, and resource allocation with precision, while rival automakers collaborated openly to meet collective goals. Information sharing and centralized oversight allowed the industrial network to operate as a unified organism, responsive to both strategic necessity and battlefield realities. This level of integration became a defining factor in sustaining global operations and achieving victory. By mid-1945, the transformation was complete. America's auto industry had evolved into a fully realized war machine, producing quantities, qualities, and varieties of material essential to global military operations. Its success redefined the concept of industrial power, proving that the ability to produce, adapt, and innovate could be as decisive as any tactical maneuver or battlefield engagement. Factories had become strategic instruments, silent but decisive participants in the shaping of history. By the summer of 1945, the industrial landscape of America had been irrevocably transformed. Auto plants, once centers of consumer desire, had become sprawling engines of war, producing not merely machines but the very means by which victory could be sustained. Factories operated with a rhythm and purpose that mirrored the urgency of the battlefield, their assembly lines translating raw materials into tools of strategic consequence. The scale and speed of production were now as decisive as the movements of armies and fleets. The refinement of standardization across multiple factories allowed components to be interchangeable, enabling rapid field repairs and reducing logistical strain. Tanks, trucks, and aircraft could be maintained and deployed with unprecedented efficiency. Engineers had learned to anticipate failure points, improve durability, and optimize designs for mass production without sacrificing quality. Every part produced carried with it a guarantee of reliability, reflecting an industrial discipline born of necessity rather than choice. Aircraft manufacturing had become a showcase of this transformation. Former automakers mastered the complexities of precision engine production, delivering power plants capable of performing under extreme temperatures, altitudes, and combat stress. The capacity to produce thousands of such engines each month provided Allied air forces with a decisive advantage, shaping campaigns across Europe and the Pacific. Here, industrial skill directly influenced military strategy, turning factories into instruments of dominance in the skies. The workforce had matured into a finely tuned mechanism in its own right. Men and women, veterans and newly trained recruits, operated under conditions of relentless pressure, mastering complex machinery and precision assembly with remarkable efficiency. Their endurance, skill, and adaptability became as critical to victory as steel, aluminum, or rubber. The factory floor was a theater of its own, where human perseverance and ingenuity translated directly into operational capability on distant battlefields. Social transformations accompanied industrial success. Women maintained production lines, supervised processes, and managed logistics, permanently expanding their roles in the workforce. Minority workers accessed skilled positions previously denied to them, challenging pre-war social hierarchies. Factories became sites of both production and societal change, demonstrating that necessity under extreme pressure could accelerate progress not only in machines, but in opportunity and social integration. Material scarcity drove continuous innovation. Shortages of critical resources such as steel and rubber forced engineers to develop synthetic alternatives, experiment with lighter alloys, and implement modular components. Each improvement, deployed across thousands of units, amplified operational effectiveness. The constant interplay between constraint and invention created a culture of rapid adaptation, proving that ingenuity under pressure could rival raw production capacity in shaping outcomes. Coordination between government and private industry reached its zenith. The War Production Board orchestrated supply, labor, and output with surgical precision, while companies shared designs, tooling, and expertise to maximize efficiency. The industrial network operated as a unified organism, responding dynamically to both strategic needs and battlefield intelligence. This level of orchestration ensured that production became a predictive, rather than reactive, instrument of military success. By late 1945, the transformation of America's auto industry into a wartime powerhouse was fully realized. Peacetime factories had been converted into strategic assets, capable of producing unparalleled quantities and qualities of material. The scale, speed, and precision achieved demonstrated that industrial power could shape the course of global conflict, making factories silent participants in history. America had proven that modern warfare could be won not only with courage and strategy, but with the relentless, disciplined output of its industrial heart. As 1945 drew to a close, the full scope of America's industrial achievement became indisputable. Factories that had once churned out cars for the open road now produced tanks, jeeps, aircraft engines, and artillery at a scale that reshaped the war itself. The transformation was not merely quantitative, it was qualitative, a complete reimagining of purpose, process, and organizational capacity. The automobile industry had become a linchpin of victory, demonstrating that the power to produce could be as decisive as the power to fight. The strategic impact of production was evident on every battlefield. Supply lines ran with unprecedented reliability, vehicles moved troops and material across continents, and aircraft engines powered missions that turned the tide of campaigns. Commanders could plan offensives with confidence, knowing that the industrial engine behind them would sustain every advance. Factories had become silent generals, orchestrating the tempo of war from thousands of miles away. The human contribution to this success was equally profound. Workers, trained rapidly and driven by urgency and purpose, had adapted to roles of increasing complexity. Women, African Americans, and other previously marginalized groups proved indispensable, mastering skills once thought beyond their reach. Labor became a weapon in itself, and the dedication of these individuals was embedded in every vehicle, every engine, and every piece of equipment. Innovation and adaptability remained central to the war effort. Engineers continually refined designs, experimented with alternative materials, and optimized assembly processes. Failures in the field were fed back into production lines, creating a dynamic loop of learning and improvement. The result was machinery that was not only abundant but increasingly reliable, able to withstand the harshest conditions encountered in battle. Government coordination ensured that production aligned seamlessly with strategic needs. The War Production Board, acting as the nerve center, prioritized materials, resolved bottlenecks, and coordinated among competing firms. Collaboration replaced competition, creating a nationwide industrial network that could respond instantaneously to changing military requirements. This integration exemplified how organization, planning, and execution could amplify raw industrial capability. The social and cultural impact of the industrial mobilization endured beyond the war. Women retained new opportunities in skilled labor, minority workers gained access to previously closed positions, and the lessons of mass production informed post-war manufacturing practices. Factories had become crucibles not just of war material, but of social transformation, reshaping the workforce and laying the foundation for America's post-war economic dominance. By the end of 1945, the transformation of the American automobile industry stood as one of the defining achievements of the Second World War. Peacetime factories had become instruments of global influence, producing not merely machines but the means to sustain and win conflict on multiple fronts. The unprecedented scale, speed, and precision of production had redefined the relationship between industry and war. In retrospect, the story of America turning its automakers into a war machine overnight is more than a tale of industrial triumph. It is a testament to human ingenuity, organizational discipline, and collective purpose under pressure. The factories of Detroit, Cleveland, and beyond became theaters of both labor and innovation, proving that in modern warfare, victory is built as much on the assembly line as on the battlefield. The war had ended, but the legacy of this industrial transformation would shape the nation and the world for generations to come.